start over? So I was reading about some of the Old Testament characters, and it put a lot of turmoil in my heart in a way, because when I really sat down and meditated on some of these characters, I realized how really flawed some of them are. And I thought, why did God use such flawed people? I guess it was sort of running up against my sense growing up that these were superheroes of some sort. That, it was like reading a story about Superman to read about Moses, or it was like reading about some comic book hero to read about David and Goliath and that kind of thing. And when I got down into really reading the details, I realized that these guys did some things that weren't so great. And some of them, it seemed like, why would God let a person with those kind of flaws do his work for him? And then it struck me that that's all he had to choose from, were flawed people. We're all flawed people. And all of them that were available then and now. So the biblical superheroes were just people like you and me. But what made them special was that God chose them and gave them what they needed to do the amazing things that we read about. And at some point, he called them to do that as well. So that slightly different viewpoint that I referred to is this. Instead of looking at these characters as superheroes or storybook characters that we read about, let's consider how they are similar to us. Let's look at what they did and consider how they felt in that moment. Let's try to identify with those characters a little bit, put ourselves in their place. And let's look at the character of the characters, if you will. But mostly my goal is to see that they're really just people like you and me, and that we're really just people like them. And maybe if we try on the idea that they weren't that different from us, it'll make it easier to apply the meanings and the lessons to our own lives. Now, let me say this before I dive in too deep. We must always keep in mind that there is one character in the Bible, if I dare call him that, who is human, but also superhuman, who doesn't have flaws, who doesn't give me any reason to be disturbed, and who is my real live hero. And that, of course, is who? You got it, Jesus. Just want to make sure that's clear. Jesus stands alone among the characters. So I started thinking about all the things that I wanted to say about several different people in the Bible, mostly the Old Testament. And I quickly realized that I had bitten off way too much. And so I thought, how about I start with just one person? So I started thinking about Moses and thinking I would talk about him. And then realized I had bitten off way too much. The story of Moses is really amazing. And we don't often take the time or get the chance to sit down and really look at the overall story of one person's life. I know for myself, I'll try to read through the Bible in a year. That takes about 3 chapters a day. And Moses covers 3 or 4 books of the Old Testament, not just chapters. So there's a lot there, an awful lot there. But again, I want to look at somewhat the character of Moses, what he was like, how he felt in different situations, and how God used those situations to change him and work on him. So most of you know the outline of his life. I'm sure you've heard it just like I have, Sunday school or church or wherever. Um, he was born into a family of slaves, just like you and me. He didn't have a choice whose family he was born into. He didn't have a choice about what environment he was born into. But later on, we can clearly see that right from the beginning, God had a plan for this guy's life. Put into a basket as a baby, floated out into the river by his mother. And one of the amazing things that I observe when reading about the characters in the Bible is the ups and downs in their lives. Sorry. There's a lot of drama in the lives of the people in the Bible. And again, that's something I start to compare to my own life and identify with. Again, he was born, no choice, gets put in a basket, floated out into the river. There's no choice in that. But later on, he could have taken on a lot of different attitudes about that. And I wonder, did he feel rejected, outcast, abandoned? Then he's picked up by Pharaoh's daughter and taken to the royal court where he's brought up. I know we've all met modern kids of certain ages, mostly teenagers I'm thinking of, it's easy to meet some of them that are very entitled. And I kind of picture him growing up in the royal household. I mean, this is Pharaoh's daughter that picks him up and wants to keep him and sort of adopt him as her kid. So you know she's going to dote on him because she thinks he's cute. And whether he's just a pet or whether he really gets treated as a son, we don't really know. But it's easy to imagine that he becomes very used to the privileged life. He gets used to his mother taking care of him and doting on him, and all her servants doting on him. Makes me wonder what he felt like when he got to the point of understanding that he wasn't born from his mother, that he was born of the Hebrews. And that makes me wonder, how confused was he? There must have been a point at which he said, am I an Egyptian or am I a Hebrew? He wouldn't have had any peers because nobody else was in that scenario. Everybody else was either clearly an Egyptian or clearly a Hebrew. And by rights, if he had been a Hebrew at the beginning, when he was born, he would have been killed. So he goes from being completely, and this is before he ever has any choice in anything, he goes from being born and taken care of by his mother very carefully to being completely rejected. I sort of want to draw a graph of his life sometimes. It's like, okay, he's born like everybody. Whoa, he's condemned to death before he's even out of the cradle. He's rejected by his family. They have no choice in it, but they set him adrift, literally. Then all of a sudden he's picked up by the royal household. Now his life goes up, the graph goes high, and he's in the privileged elite of the world, where he lives for quite a while. And we can imagine in that time maybe he went to school, maybe he learned to fight, maybe who knows what they were teaching him. But you know there must have been some education, probably along with all that privilege. Perhaps he learned languages politics. He got to at least watch leadership and how it happened. Who knows what he learned about religion during that time? We can only imagine. But now he becomes an adult. So he goes out as an adult in this privileged, high-level life, never has to worry about what he has to eat, who's going to take care of him, where he's going to live, any of those things that some of us might have to worry about. And he goes out, and I can picture him in his questioning, am I a Hebrew? I'm going to go see the Hebrews. And he goes out, and he witnesses an Egyptian man whipping one of the Hebrew slaves and beating him badly. And he gets so mad that he gets in a fight with the guy and kills him. So that's one of the first places where I say, oh, God chose a murderer to do his work here. I mean, how bad can you get? He killed a guy, and then he buries him in the sand and tries to hide it. So we know that he knows that it's wrong. And he doesn't just get himself in trouble with Pharaoh about it, but the Hebrews as well, because the next part of the story is he goes and tries to break up a fight the next day between two Hebrews. And they turn on him and say, who are you to be the judge? Who are you to try to break us up? Are you going to try and kill one of us too? And then he realizes he's got no friends. He's got no family. He's got a lot of trouble with Pharaoh if Pharaoh finds out, and Pharaoh does find out. So his only choice is to run. So now his life goes from up here on the chart, crashes to even lower than the Hebrews. He can't even stay with the Hebrews. He can't stay with the slaves. So he goes from being the elite to being lower than the lowest and has to run for it. So he flees the country and goes out and tries to find a place to live in the desert where he's safe, where nobody knows him. But one of the amazing things about Moses' life is he was definitely a full-grown adult by the time this happens. And we know that, tradition has it that he was probably about 40 years old when he goes out into the desert to the land of Midian. And he ends up meeting some girls in the desert who are having trouble with the other shepherds in the desert. And so this point in his life, he's got nowhere to live, he's got nobody to live with, and he does end up finding a family to live with. So he's taken in, so he sort of comes up the graph a little bit now. At least he's being taken care of, and he's got a place to live. But what a difference, what a contrast between being in the elite and then going down and living in the desert. He spends at least 40 years living with this family in the desert. At that point, he becomes a father. He becomes a husband first, then he becomes a father, and becomes a son-in-law, becomes a shepherd. Probably a whole different vision than he had when he lived in the royal palace. Who knows what he was thinking when he was growing up in the palace, what he would become. Maybe he dreamt about becoming a pharaoh. Who knows? He must have learned a lot in that desert in 40 years. Relationships, patience, hard work without that royal comfort. How to serve instead of just being served. Now I try to identify with 40 years of scratching out a living as a goat herder. And I have to tell you, I have a little experience with herding sheep. I lived on a farm in West Virginia for a while when I was in my late teens and got to help take care of the sheep. And it's something that I've always wanted to communicate about sheep in the Bible, because we have the idea of sheep quite often in the Bible, and sometimes it's applied to us as God's sheep. And when God says we're his sheep, or Jesus says he's the shepherd, we're the sheep, it's not a compliment. Sheep are some of the dumbest animals, and they do really stupid things. Like when you're taking care of sheep, they'll be coming across the field toward you, and one of them, for no apparent reason, will hop over something that's not even there. They'll just take a hop. And all the other sheep that follow that sheep will take a hop at the same place. It's like, oh, Joe hopped over something, so we better hop over it, whatever it is. And they follow mindlessly, but they all do it. And they're very easy victims. And that's why if a wolf comes, or if a dog comes, a wild dog, and gets in the herd of sheep, it can devastate them because they freeze. They don't even run away. They just freeze. And that's how we used to, if you're going to shear a sheep, that's how you totally control a sheep, is you grab them by the throat, and they just freeze. And you can do anything you want with them. And that goes for the smallest lamb or the biggest ram. You can take a big ram, you just grab them right here, and they freeze. So, being called sheep is not a compliment. Anyway, I'm probably going too far with that. But it's always interesting to me that dealing with sheep is not an easy job because they're so dumb. They're so easily victimized. And Moses is living out in the desert with a bunch of sheep. And that's his life for 40 years. Now I try to identify with 40 years of being a goat herder. And I think about the long, dry, disappointing times in my life. What was I doing? And even more important, what was God doing during those times? Was he using that time to change me? Was he using that time to teach me patience? How to be a husband, how to be a father? Things that were going to be important later on. Did I learn how to work hard just to survive? God took at least 40 years to change Moses into the man that he was ready to trust with the mission ahead. So when he sees the burning bush and God comes to him and tells him, it's time for you to go and lead my people, he's about 80 years old at that point. And that's the beginning of his mission. That thought gives me a lot of hope because I'm only 65, so I got at least 15 years before God's got me ready to start using me. If only that were true. So now God says, and I know Pastor would want me to do more reading of the word here. I'm going to go to Exodus chapter 3. (7 through 20). Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 through 20. So this is God speaking to Moses out of the burning bush. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, but I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. And Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now, please, let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go. A couple of points here. First of all, again, going back to, are these characters in the Bible superheroes? You know, Moses didn't do any of this. Moses was the man that God set up to carry out his work. But God clearly states, I will do this. I am the one who is going to do this. I will send you there. I will give you the power. I will do everything. God's doing it. So again, for me, it's a shifting. Okay, Moses isn't the superhuman. He's the messenger. He's given superhuman powers in some cases to do superhuman things, but it's God giving him the power to do it. So he goes with Aaron to see Pharaoh. Now I want to take a little side trip here and tell you a little bit about Pharaoh. And I can tell you this because I went to Egypt one time. My sister lived in Egypt for quite a period of time, and with her husband and her kids, and they ran a school in Cairo, the Cairo American College. And so during that time, my mother called me up and said, hey, I want to go visit your sister, but I need somebody to travel with me. You want to go? And I was like, oh yeah, I definitely want to go. So I got to go to Egypt for a couple of weeks and visit. And it's great when you can go someplace like that on your travels and you've got the inside story. You've got the people that live there and actually can tell you where to go. You know, you're not on a tourist trip where, okay, we're all going to go over here to McDonald's and have lunch, even though we're in Russia, you know, or something like that. You know, it's like you're going to get to experience the real thing because they had lived there, and they told me where to go and what to do. We did go on a tour on a tour boat down the Nile, which was a wonderful experience. But specifically about Ramses, and this guy Ramses had an ego that has to be one of the biggest in history. I mean, this guy's ego makes Donald Trump look like a mouse, but in comparison. He was so in love with himself. Either that or he was trying to convince the whole world that he was really a god, which it makes me wonder. Again, I try to identify with the feelings of people and what was really going on in their heads. But this guy built the biggest statues. I went to this one, this great big temple. It's called Abu Simbel, and very famous. And you walk up to this place, and there's these stone statues that are carved out of solid rock, and they are half again as high as the steeple out front here, and just massive. And there's 4 of them, not just one, but he has 4 of them. And those are sort of the front door to this temple. And they're all of him in different stages. Okay, they're not other gods, they're Ramses. So it's like Ramses, 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 Ramses when you walk up to this thing. And then you walk inside, and mind you, this is carved into a solid rock mountain. And you walk inside this huge room, and the ceiling and these giant columns, the columns are solid rock this big around, holding up this giant stone ceiling. And the ceiling is all carved, and the columns are all carved with hieroglyphics. And it's all about the stories of Ramses and how great Ramses is. And they're not just carved, but then they're painted in detail. It's just spectacular craftsmanship in all of this. Of course, most of it's faded, but there's places where you can still see the actual colors of the paintings, and they're beautiful, beautiful carved 3D paintings. And then you walk through this big room. It's probably square footage about the size of this room, and you go through another door into another room, and it's a little bit smaller, but it's also very carved and detailed, and there's an altar in the back of this room. And you go to this altar, and there's 3 gods carved, and they're only about probably 3 feet tall each. So there's, I think it's the god of the sun, and then there's the god of the Nile on the other side, and then between them is Ramses. So he puts himself right between the other 2 gods. And you think, wow, this is pretty amazing. The guy really, really thinks he's the greatest ever. But there's even one more detail that's amazing. On one day out of the year, the sun rises in just the right angle so that the light comes in the giant front door, goes down through the back door of this little room in the back temple, which it's a long stretch to that back room. And the light from the rising sun shines on the face of the middle statue of Ramses, and only on Ramses, not on the other 2 gods. So, like I said, and this was just one of the installations that this guy had built about himself. He was like the longest reigning pharaoh. He reigned for like 67 years. He had lots of wars he fought. In fact, a lot of the stories on the temples were about the captured slaves from Ethiopia and all places all up and down the coast. So he was a big shot, but he was really in love with himself. And this is the guy that Moses goes face to face with. Now, the other thing about what we just read that strikes me is Moses says, if I come to the people Well, even before that. But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" I think he's gotten quite a bit of humility built into him now. He's gone from being that arrogant grandson of the Pharaoh who goes out and tries to right wrongs by fighting and killing people, to being a humble guy who says, "Who am I that you're going to send me?" He probably sees himself and identifies himself more as a goat herder now than as an elite. And I see that 40 years of being in the desert is a big part of what God needed to do to him to get him to the place where he could use him. God couldn't use an arrogant person at that point. He had to make the Moses he needed, and he did, no matter how long it took. And he even says, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,'" in other words, if you send me and I go and I tell them this, they're not going to believe me. They're not going to want to follow me. Who do I say sent me? Under what authority do I give them? So he's really changed. He's changed a lot. So he goes, he faces off with the Pharaoh, and this is more of the story that we're all familiar with. I mean, he has the staff that turns into a snake. He has then the plagues happen. But even after these things happen and Pharaoh says, "Okay, go," he goes and tries to leave with everybody, and then Pharaoh changes his mind. Imagine what it feels like to be between the Pharaoh and the people of Israel. The people of Israel are getting really angry at him because he said it was time to go, and he made them all hopeful and believe that they were going to go. And then Pharaoh shows up or sends his people down and says, "No, you're not going. You stay and you work. In fact, you work harder." And that didn't make him at all popular, I'm sure. So he's got Pharaoh on one side, who's really angry at him for all the things that are going on. And he's got his people on the other side who are really angry at him. I wouldn't want to be in that place. But somehow through this strange life that he's lived through, he's in a place where he can at least go to God and say, "What do I do?" He doesn't run again. He goes to God and he says, "What should I do? Why have you sent me here to do this when it's not working?" So they go through water. In the Nile turns to blood. All the fish die. Frogs, gnats, flies, boils on the skin, hail, locusts. And what's amazing is the Hebrews are living right there with the Egyptians, and it's not happening to them, it's only happening to the Egyptians. Then the darkness, then of course, death of the firstborn in the Passover, and we're familiar with that story. Then they get to the crossing of the Red Sea. Imagine standing, talk about between a rock and a hard place. Standing next to the sea with about 1 million people that you've let out there, literally about 1 million people. And you can see in the distance, here comes Pharaoh's army. They're coming to take us back. You can imagine the panic in all those people. What's going to happen? Are they going to kill us? They're going to beat us? They're going to drag us back? But, again, he's been built to the point where he understands he's been sent. He turns to God, and he gets the solution. So again, if we look at that chart of Moses' life, it's really going up and down. It's really climbing. It's really dropping. Anybody here like me? You've had times in your life where things felt really good, and then all of a sudden something goes wrong and you crash. And then maybe it's a long time before it comes back up, and you get encouraged, and you get excited, and you have a good time, and then it goes down again, and then it goes up again. This, I guess I find comfort in knowing there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually part of God's plan. That He uses those things. He uses the high points and the low points. Quite often He uses the low points more, it seems. But 40 years in the desert, there was a lot of grumbling going on during those 40 years. The lesson to me when I think about that is that I shouldn't expect life to be easy and comfortable. I shouldn't expect to be living in Pharaoh's palace. That's not what this life is about. And we wouldn't even know about Moses if that's all he had done. But because of the hardships, he was changed. He was made into someone that God could send. So we shouldn't be afraid of the suffering. We all know that God can use suffering. In fact, we should, if we have enough faith, we should understand that suffering is necessary in a lot of cases to change us. Moses suffered a lot in order to become the superhero that he was. And I think that's important to see. 40 years more in the desert. He gets 40 years. We all know the Red Sea story. Okay, they get through the Red Sea. That's the high point. They got through the Red Sea. They went from, at one point, believing that they were about to be dragged back to slavery, to crossing the Red Sea and finding out, wow, we never have to worry about those Egyptians again. They just got completely and utterly wiped out. And they rejoiced. There's a famous song. I know Mary knows it. I will sing unto the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and the rider are thrown into the sea. Right? That's Miriam's song that they sing after they get to the other side and the horses are gone and the chariots are gone. So a lot happens in the desert. I can't begin to go through 40 years of Moses' life in the desert. But by the time he gets to the other end of the desert, I'm going to take a big jump here. He's 120 years old. And he's not only been changed by God and used by God in mighty ways, he's actually defended the people at times. He's become the priest, the intermediary between God and the people in a lot of cases. In several cases, he stands in the place where he has to defend them and ask God not to kill them all. So it's an incredible up and down story. And I think if we look honestly at our own lives, we see a lot of up and downs. And we can identify with a lot of the up and downs that Moses goes through. And even when he gets to 120 years old and he's at the end of the desert and they're about to cross into the promised land, God says, you're not going in because you screwed up at one point. And that's it seems pretty harsh, but we know that God loved him. We know that God used his life. One of the biggest things that Moses got used for was bringing down the Ten Commandments. And when you turn to Jesus and you ask, what are the most important commandments? love the Lord your God and love others like yourself, and you've covered it. It's the way I like to look at it. That all came down during Moses' time. But we need to remember that. It's what Jesus said. It's what Jesus was doing with Moses through all that time, was teaching him the truth. The truth is, you have to love God and you have to love others. Let's pray. Lord, help us to identify not just with Moses, but with your Son. Help us to understand to some extent what he went through, the suffering and what it meant for our sake. Help us, Lord, to understand what suffering means to us. Help us to have vision for what you're doing in our lives when we suffer as well as when we are full of joy, when it's easy to worship you and when it's hard to drag ourselves to church. Help us to remember that you're still there, you're still working on us, and that maybe you're working in ways that are more powerful than the joyful times. Help us, Lord, to remember to make you first. Help us to love you first with all our hearts and minds and souls and spirits and everything that we are, Lord. Help us to turn it to love for you. And then let that love shine in the form of loving each other. I pray all of these things in Jesus' name.